Thomas Mitchell stood at the back of the funeral home, his shoulders stiff in the black suit he hadn't worn since his college graduation. The collar felt too tight, but he knew it wasn't the shirt choking him. It was being back in Oak Ridge after 15 years away. The small Connecticut town hadn't changed much, still nestled between rolling hills and anchored by the same Main Street shops, just with different names on some of the storefronts. His father's casket sat at the front of the room, adorned with a modest arrangement of white lilies. Richard Mitchell had been many things: town doctor, community leader, stubborn as hell, but flashy was never one of them. The funeral reflected that simplicity. Thomas scanned the room, recognizing faces that had aged but remained familiar. Mrs. Henderson from the library, Coach Peterson, now walking with a cane, the Donovans from next door. And then there was his sister Sarah, standing by the casket, accepting condolences with grace. Her husband stood beside her, a protective hand on the small of her back. Their two children sat quietly in the front row, the boy fidgeting with his tie while the girl leaned against her grandmother, Thomas's stepmother, Eleanor. Eleanor. Thomas's jaw clenched at the sight of her. She'd been married to his father for 12 years now, entering their lives after his mother had been gone for barely a year. He'd never forgiven his father for that, for replacing his mother so quickly with this woman who was only 15 years older than Thomas himself. "Hello, stranger." The voice came from beside him, quiet but unmistakable. Thomas turned to see his older brother Michael, his once dark hair now threaded with gray. They hadn't spoken since their fight at their father's 70th birthday 5 years ago. "Mike." Thomas nodded, unsure what else to say. "Didn't think you'd make it," Michael said, his tone carrying no particular judgment, just stating a fact. "He was still my father." Michael nodded. "Sarah will be glad you came." She was worried. A heavy silence fell between them, filled with unasked questions and unsaid accusations. It was Michael who finally broke it. "There's a meeting tomorrow. At Dad's house. The lawyer's coming to read the will." He paused. "You should be there." Thomas felt a flare of anger. "I don't care about the will. You might after you hear it." Michael looked at him meaningfully. "It's not what any of us expected." Before Thomas could ask what he meant, Sarah approached, her eyes rimmed red but dry. She looked like their mother. The same heart-shaped face, the same kind eyes. Without a word, she pulled Thomas into a tight hug. "You came," she whispered. "I'm sorry I haven't been around, Sarah." She pulled back and gave him a sad smile. "You're here now? That's what matters." Thomas wasn't sure that was true. Being back in Oak Ridge only reminded him of all the reasons he'd stayed away. The suffocating expectations, the shadow of his father's reputation, the way everyone in town had taken sides after his mother died, and Richard had moved on so quickly with Eleanor. The afternoon dragged on, a blur of handshakes and hollow condolences. Thomas noticed Eleanor watching him from across the room, but made no effort to approach her. What would he say to the woman who had replaced his mother, who had lived in his childhood home longer than his mother ever had, who had, in his mind, erased the last remnants of Evelyn Mitchell from his father's life? By evening, most of the mourners had left. Thomas found himself alone in the side room of the funeral home, staring out the window at the maple trees lining the street. Their leaves were just beginning to turn, spots of orange and red among the green. "Your father wanted to reconcile, you know." Thomas turned to find Eleanor in the doorway. She'd aged well, her blonde hair now silver but still stylishly cut, her posture straight despite her 70 years. He had a funny way of showing it. Thomas responded, harder than he intended. "He was a proud man. Like someone else I know." Eleanor stepped into the room but kept her distance. "He called you. Every birthday. Every Christmas." Calls that lasted 2 minutes because neither of us knew what to say. Eleanor sighed. "He saved all your articles. Had them framed in his study." This surprised Thomas. He'd been a foreign correspondent for the Boston Globe for over a decade, covering conflicts and crises across the world. He'd never imagined his father taking any interest in his work. "Tomorrow's going to be difficult," Eleanor continued. "Your father made some decisions that—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Well, they may not be what you and your siblings expect." Thomas felt a chill. "What does that mean?" "It's not my place to say, but I want you to know that I urged him to be fair." "Fair?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "Nothing about this family has ever been fair." Eleanor's expression hardened slightly. "You're not the only one who's suffered loss, Thomas. Your father was a complicated man who made mistakes, but he loved all his children. even the one who could never forgive him. She turned to leave, but stopped at the doorway. Dinner at the house tonight. 6 o'clock. Sarah's cooking. It would mean a lot to her if you came. Thomas didn't answer, and Eleanor didn't wait for one. After she left, he pulled out his phone and booked a room at the Oak Ridge Inn. The thought of sleeping in his childhood home, with all its ghosts and memories, was more than he could bear. Yet as he drove through town toward the inn, Thomas found himself turning onto Maple Street instead, toward the white colonial house with green shutters where he'd grown up, where his father had just died. Where, tomorrow, some lawyer would read words that might reopen wounds Thomas had spent 15 years trying to heal. As he pulled into the driveway, he saw Sarah through the kitchen window, stirring something on the stove while her daughter set the table. Michael was on the front porch, nursing what looked like a whiskey. And through the living room window, he caught a glimpse of Eleanor, alone, looking at what appeared to be an old photograph. Thomas sat in his car, engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel. Coming back to Oak Ridge had been hard enough. Stepping into that house might be impossible. But as he watched his family, broken, complicated, but still his, he knew he couldn't run away again. Not until he faced whatever his father had left behind. Dinner was a stilted affair. Thomas sat between his niece Emma and nephew Jack, grateful for the buffer they provided. At 12 and 10, they were curious about their uncle who lived in Boston and traveled to far-off places. Their innocent questions about his work offered respite from the charged silence between the adults. "Did you really see a real desert with camels?" Jack asked, eyes wide with wonder. "I did," Thomas replied, cutting into the pot roast Sarah had prepared, their mother's recipe. "In Morocco, the sand dunes were taller than buildings." "I want to travel when I grow up," Emma declared. "Dad says I have to wait until college, though." Michael cleared his throat. "I said maybe during college. Let's get through middle school first." Sarah refilled wine glasses while her husband David kept the conversation flowing, asking Thomas about his recent assignment in Ukraine. Thomas appreciated the effort, even if it felt forced. David had always been the peacemaker, attempting to bridge the gulf between Thomas and the rest of the family during the rare occasions they were together. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, in Richard's seat. The symbolism wasn't lost on Thomas. She'd taken his father's place in more ways than one. "Thomas," Eleanor said during a lull, "your father's study is just as you might remember it. He kept all your school awards on the wall." Thomas took a long sip of wine. "That's surprising. I figured he'd have taken them down after I chose journalism over medical school." Sarah sighed. "Tom, please. Not tonight." "It's a fair observation," Michael interjected, his tone carefully neutral but his eyes challenging. Dad was disappointed. He never made a secret of that. He was concerned, Eleanor corrected, not disappointed. He worried about Thomas's safety reporting from conflict zones. Thomas laughed drily. "Is that what he told you?" "Because he told me I was wasting my potential on sensationalist fluff." "You were 22, Michael said. "We all say things we don't mean when we're arguing with our kids." "Except I wasn't a kid, and he meant every word." Thomas set down his fork. "Can we skip the revisionist history? Dad made it clear I was the family disappointment. Let's not pretend otherwise just because he's gone." Emma and Jack exchanged uncomfortable glances. David gently suggested they finish dinner in the den with their tablets. Once the children had left, the tension in the room thickened. "I don't understand why you're so determined to remember only the worst of him," Sarah said quietly, her eyes glistening. "He was proud of you, Tom, even if he struggled to show it. Was he proud when he told me not to come to Mom's birthday dinner because Eleanor would be uncomfortable? Or when he said I was betraying Mom's memory by not accepting his new marriage?" "That's not what happened," Eleanor said firmly. "You weren't there?" Thomas shot back. "No, but I heard him crying afterward," Eleanor replied, her composure cracking slightly. "Do you think this was easy for any of us? Richard lost his wife of 30 years. You kids lost your mother. And I stepped into a family still raw with grief." Michael rubbed his temples. "This is exactly why we haven't all been in the same room for 5 years." A heavy silence fell over the table, broken only by the distant sound of the children laughing at something on their tablets. "Dad changed his will last month," Sarah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Right after his diagnosis." Thomas looked up sharply. "What diagnosis?" The siblings exchanged glances. "Pancreatic cancer," Michael said. "Stage 4 by the time they found it. He didn't want treatment." Thomas set down his glass, so hard wine sloshed onto the tablecloth. And nobody thought to tell me. He asked us not to, Sarah admitted, not meeting his eyes. He said he didn't want your pity, just your forgiveness. And he knew you wouldn't come. The truth of her words stung because Thomas couldn't honestly say she was wrong. Would he have come back to see his father one last time, knowing the old man was dying? Or would he have used work as an excuse to stay away, as he had for so many holidays and family gatherings? The doctor gave him 3 months, Eleanor added softly. He lasted 5, stubborn to the end. Despite himself, Thomas felt a smile tug at his lips. That sounds like Dad. He spent most of that time putting his affairs in order, Michael said. The practice, the house, the will. He was methodical about it. And secretive, Sarah added. Even his lawyer wouldn't give us hints about what changes he made. David returned from checking on the children. They're fine, he reported, taking his seat beside Sarah. Though I think they know something's up with all the tension. Thomas felt a pang of guilt. His niece and nephew deserved better than to have their grandfather's funeral dinner ruined by old grievances. What happens to the house? Thomas asked, genuinely curious for the first time. The colonial on Maple Street had been in the Mitchell family for 3 generations. That's part of tomorrow's surprise, apparently, Michael replied, glancing at Eleanor. She shook her head. I truly don't know all the details. Richard and I had separate finances. He only told me that he'd made things right. Thomas frowned. What does that mean? I guess we'll find out tomorrow, Sarah said, standing to clear the plates. Mom would have hated seeing us like this, you know, fighting over Dad's deathbed. The mention of their mother hung in the air. Evelyn Mitchell had been the heart of the family, warm where Richard was reserved, diplomatic where he was blunt, nurturing where he was demanding. Her death from a sudden stroke at 56 had shattered them all in different ways. Thomas helped Sarah clear the table, a peace offering of sorts. In the kitchen, away from the others, his sister spoke quietly. I found some old home videos last week. From that summer at Lake George when you were about 13. Remember how Dad taught you to sail? Thomas did remember. It was one of the rare times his father had shown patience, guiding him through the basics without criticism or correction. Just encouragement and quiet pride when Thomas finally managed to catch the wind properly. He kept that little model sailboat you made in woodshop, Sarah continued. It's on his dresser upstairs. Thomas didn't know how to respond. These glimpses of sentimentality didn't align with the stern, critical father he remembered. People are complicated, Tom. Dad loved you. He just didn't know how to bridge the gap once it formed. And maybe you didn't either. She squeezed his arm and returned to the dining room, leaving Thomas alone with a sink full of dishes and memories he'd tried hard to suppress. Later, as Thomas prepared to leave for the inn, Eleanor approached him at the door. Your father left something for you in his study. A letter. He asked me to make sure you got it tonight, before tomorrow's meeting. She pressed an envelope into his hand, his name written in his father's precise handwriting. Thomas stared at it, torn between wanting to tear it open and wanting to throw it away unread. Whatever he wrote, Eleanor said, remember that he was trying to make peace in his own way. Thomas nodded stiffly and pocketed the letter. Good night, Eleanor. As he drove to the inn through the quiet streets of Oak Ridge, the envelope seemed to burn in his pocket. At a stoplight, he pulled it out, turning it over in his hands. Whatever message his father had left, whatever confessions or accusations or justifications, Thomas wasn't ready to read them yet. But as he checked into the Oak Ridge Inn and settled into a room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpet, Thomas knew he couldn't delay forever. Tomorrow would bring revelations he couldn't predict. His father's final words might be the only preparation he would get. The Oak Ridge Inn hadn't changed since Thomas last stayed there for his high school reunion a decade ago. The same faded floral bedspreads, the same landscape paintings bolted to the walls, the same complimentary coffee packets that promised robust flavor but delivered something closer to warm dishwater. He sat on the edge of the bed, turning his father's letter over in his hands for what felt like the 100th time. The clock on the bedside table read 11:42 p.m., almost midnight, and sleep seemed impossible. Outside, a light rain had started, tapping against the window like impatient fingers. Thomas finally tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of his father's personalized stationery, Richard Mitchell, M.D. embossed at the top. The handwriting was shakier than Thomas remembered, revealing the illness that had claimed his father's life. Thomas. The letter began without preamble. So like his father, direct, unsentimental. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. I don't have much time left, and there are things that need saying between us. Things I should have said years ago. First, I was wrong about your career choice. Your mother always told me I was too hard on you, expecting you to follow in my footsteps without considering what you wanted. She was right, as she usually was. I've read every article you've written. Your coverage from Syria moved me to tears, something I haven't admitted to anyone, not even Eleanor. You're a fine journalist, and I was too stubborn to tell you that. Second, about Eleanor. I know you never forgave me for remarrying so quickly after your mother died. The truth is, I was drowning in grief. Eleanor was your mother's friend before she was ever mine. She came by with casseroles and to help sort through Evelyn's things when I couldn't bring myself to do it. She listened to me talk about your mother for hours. She knew I would never stop loving Evelyn, and she didn't ask me to. I didn't tell you this before because it felt too private, too raw, but Evelyn and I had talked about what would happen if one of us died. We were doctors. We knew death doesn't always wait until you're ready. Your mother made me promise not to spend my remaining years alone. She specifically mentioned Eleanor, said she was the only woman in Oak Ridge with enough backbone to put up with me. Your mother knew me too well. I understand why you stayed away. I made it easy for you to believe I'd moved on without a backward glance. The truth was more complicated, as truth usually is. There's more you need to know, but I'm saving that for the will reading. Michael thinks I'm making a mistake with what I've decided, but he doesn't understand what I'm trying to accomplish. Maybe you won't either, but I hope someday you will. I've never been good at saying the important things. Your mother was our translator, helping us understand each other. Without her, we both retreated to what we knew best. Me to my stubborn silence, you to your righteous anger. But know this, I have always been proud of you, Thomas. Always. Your father, Richard. Thomas read the letter 3 times, his vision blurring on the third pass. He set it down on the nightstand and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain to watch the rain now falling steadily. Across the street, the town square was empty except for the occasional car passing through, headlights reflecting off the wet pavement. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. You okay? Did you read it? Thomas typed back. I read it. I'm fine. See you tomorrow. It was easier than trying to explain the storm of emotions the letter had unleashed. Anger that his father had waited until death to say what needed saying. Relief that the words had been said at all. Confusion about what the will might contain that required this preface. And somewhere, deeper than the rest, a profound sadness for all the years wasted on pride and misunderstanding. He pulled out his laptop and searched his email archive for his father's name. There weren't many exchanges, holiday greetings, a terse congratulations when Thomas won a journalism award, logistical details about insurance when Thomas turned 30. Nothing substantial. Nothing that hinted at the father who had saved his articles or kept his childhood sailboat. Then Thomas remembered something Sarah had said at dinner about old home videos. On impulse, he pulled up the family photo album he'd digitized years ago but rarely looked at. There he was at 14, gangly and serious, standing beside his father on the dock at Lake George. Richard had an arm around Thomas's shoulders, and both were squinting into the sun, similar half-smiles on their faces. Thomas searched for other photos of them together and realized how few there were beyond his childhood. They had drifted apart long before his mother died, he realized. He'd gone to college determined to forge his own path, rejecting his father's medical legacy. The arguments had started then, about Thomas's English major, about the summer he spent backpacking through Europe instead of doing a hospital internship, about his decision to pursue journalism instead of a real profession. He'd blamed Eleanor for the final rift, but the truth was the foundation had been cracking for years. Eleanor had just been an easy target for his anger after his mother died. A knock on his door startled him. It was nearly 1 a.m. Thomas approached cautiously and looked through the peephole to find Michael standing in the hallway, hands shoved in his pockets. Thomas opened the door. It's late. Couldn't sleep, Michael said with a shrug. Saw your light was still on. How did you know which room I was in? Small town. Gloria at the front desk was in my class at Oak Ridge High. Michael nodded toward the letter on the nightstand. You read it? Yeah. Thomas stepped back, allowing his brother to enter. You know what it says? Michael shook his head. Dad just told me he'd written to you. Said it was between you two. He gestured toward the chair by the window. Mind if I sit? Thomas nodded his permission and returned to the edge of the bed. The brothers sat in silence for a moment, the rain outside providing a gentle soundtrack to the awkwardness within. Sarah's worried about tomorrow, Michael finally said. She thinks Dad's will is going to cause more problems than it solves. And what do you think? Michael sighed deeply. I think Dad was trying to fix something broken, but he might end up breaking it worse. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like their father it made Thomas's chest tighten. He was not himself at the end, Tom. The pain medication, the cancer. He wasn't thinking clearly. He sounded lucid enough in his letter. That was before the worst of it. The last few weeks. Michael shook his head. He kept talking about making amends, setting things right. But he wouldn't tell me what that meant exactly. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Is that why you're here? To warn me. I'm here because you're my brother, and tomorrow's going to be hard on all of us. Michael leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Whatever Dad decided, we need to remember we're family. You, me, Sarah, the kids, and Eleanor. Thomas couldn't keep the edge from his voice. Michael's expression hardened slightly. Yes, Eleanor too. She was good to Dad, Tom. Better than he probably deserved sometimes. She made his last years happy. Thomas wanted to argue, but found he didn't have the energy for it. Not at 1 a.m, not with his father's letter still fresh in his mind. What time is the meeting tomorrow? 10. Dad's lawyer, Jenkins, is coming to the house. Michael stood. I should let you get some sleep. At the door, he paused. I'm glad you came back, Tom. Whatever happens tomorrow. After Michael left, Thomas couldn't settle. He pulled out his laptop again and began typing. Not an article or a report, but reflections on his father, his family, the town he'd left behind. Writing had always been how he processed things, made sense of the chaotic and painful. Tonight was no different. He wrote about his earliest memories of his father, teaching him to ride a bike, showing him how to use a stethoscope, quizzing him on bones in the human body. He wrote about the camping trips and the sailing lessons and the silent car rides after Thomas's high school football games, where he never quite measured up to Richard's unspoken expectations. He wrote about his mother, her laugh, her way of diffusing tension between father and son, her garden that bloomed even in the New England winters because she'd set up grow lights in the basement. He wrote about her death and how it had left them all unmoored, reaching for anchors that weren't there anymore. And finally, he wrote about Eleanor, trying for the first time to see her not as an interloper, but as a woman who had loved both his parents in different ways, who had, according to Richard's letter, been invited into their lives by his mother herself. It was nearly dawn when Thomas finished writing. The rain had stopped, and the first hints of sunrise colored the sky outside his window. He saved the document, closed his laptop, and finally fell into an exhausted sleep, dreaming of sailboats and his father's hand on his shoulder, steady and sure against the wind. The Mitchell house looked different in the morning light, smaller somehow, more vulnerable without the protective cover of darkness. Thomas arrived 10 minutes before the scheduled meeting, having showered and changed into the only other outfit he'd packed, navy slacks and a gray button-down that had spent the night folded in his duffel bag. He hadn't planned on staying more than a day. Sarah greeted him at the door, already dressed in a simple black dress, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She looked tired but composed. Coffee's in the kitchen, she said, accepting his brief hug. The kids are at school. David took them and went on to work. She lowered her voice. He thought this should be just family. Thomas nodded, grateful for his brother-in-law's tact. In the kitchen, he found Michael leaning against the counter, scrolling through emails on his phone. Eleanor sat at the table, a cup of tea in front of her, staring out the window at the garden. No one spoke as Thomas poured himself coffee. The doorbell rang at precisely 10 o'clock. Sarah returned with Jeffrey Jenkins, the Mitchell family lawyer for as long as Thomas could remember. He was well into his 70s now, his once robust frame stooped with age, but his eyes were as sharp as ever beneath bushy white eyebrows. Thomas, Jenkins said, extending a hand. Good to see you again, though I wish it were under better circumstances. Thomas shook the offered hand. Mr. Jenkins. Jeff, please. I think we're well past formalities at this point. They gathered in Richard's study, the one room in the house that seemed unchanged from Thomas's childhood. The same mahogany desk dominated the space. The same medical texts lined the shelves. The same worn leather chair sat behind the desk. The only additions were framed newspaper articles on one wall. Thomas's articles, he realized with a jolt. Jenkins set his briefcase on the desk and removed several documents. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to note that Richard was of sound mind when he made these changes. He was very specific about his wishes and understood the potential complications they might create." Thomas glanced at Michael, who was staring resolutely at the floor, and then at Sarah, who clutched a tissue in her hand. Eleanor sat straight-backed in an armchair, her expression unreadable. "Let's proceed," Jenkins said, putting on reading glasses. "I, Richard Allen Mitchell, being of sound mind, do hereby make and declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils." He continued through the standard legal preamble before reaching the substance of the will. Most of Richard's financial assets were divided equally among his 3 children, with generous provisions for his grandchildren's education. His medical practice, which he'd sold upon retirement 5 years earlier, had already been converted to investments that would continue to provide income for the family. Then Jenkins cleared his throat. Regarding the Mitchell family home at 47 Maple Street, Oak Ridge, Connecticut, which has been in the Mitchell family for 3 generations. Thomas felt himself tense. This was it, whatever surprise his father had planned. "I hereby bequeath the property and all its contents to my son, Thomas Richard Mitchell, with the following condition. Thomas must reside in the home for a period of not less than 1 year from the date of my death. During this period, my wife Eleanor Mitchell shall retain the right to live in the guest house on the property. If Thomas chooses not to fulfill this condition, the house shall be sold and the proceeds divided equally among my 3 children." The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas felt as if all the air had been sucked from the room. He looked from Jenkins to Michael to Sarah, waiting for someone to say this was a joke or a mistake. "That's not possible," he finally managed. "I live in Boston. I have a job, an apartment. There's more," Jenkins said quietly, adjusting his glasses. "Furthermore, I appoint Thomas Richard Mitchell as trustee of the Eleanor Mitchell Life Estate Trust, which I have established to provide for my wife's financial needs. Thomas shall oversee the monthly distributions to Eleanor and manage the investments contained therein. All decisions regarding the trust must be approved by Thomas, though he is instructed to consider Eleanor's input and wishes." "This is insane," Thomas said, standing abruptly. "Dad knew I can't stay in Oak Ridge. And why would he make me Eleanor's trustee? We barely speak." Michael's face had turned to stone. "I told you he wasn't thinking clearly at the end." "Actually," Jenkins interjected, "Richard was quite lucid when he made these arrangements. He understood exactly what he was doing." "Which was what?" Sarah asked, her voice small. "Forcing Tom to upend his life or punishing all of us if he doesn't." Jenkins sighed, removed his glasses, and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Richard left a letter explaining his reasoning. He asked that I read it aloud after the will." "Another letter?" Thomas asked, thinking of the one he'd read last night. Jenkins nodded and pulled out an envelope. He broke the seal and unfolded several pages covered in the same handwriting as Thomas's letter, though steadier, suggesting it had been written earlier in Richard's illness. "To my family," Jenkins read. "If Jeff is reading this, then I am gone, and you have just heard the terms of my will. I imagine there is confusion, perhaps anger. I owe you an explanation. The Mitchell house has been in our family since my grandfather built it in 1923. It was meant to be passed down through generations, a constant in a changing world. When I die, Thomas will have been away from Oak Ridge for 15 years. Too long. This family has been fractured since Evelyn died. Partly my fault, partly circumstances beyond our control. The house is the only thing left that connects us all. Thomas, I'm not trying to force you home out of spite or control. I'm offering you a chance to reconnect with your roots, to spend time in the place where your mother's spirit still lives in every room. A year is long enough to decide if Oak Ridge could be home again, short enough that you could return to Boston afterward if you choose. As for making you Eleanor's trustee, this isn't punishment for either of you. It's an opportunity. Eleanor knew nothing of this arrangement, so please don't blame her. I've watched you both avoid each other for years, each nursing separate griefs that have never been shared. Eleanor loved your mother too, Thomas. Almost as much as I did. Almost as much as you did. Michael, Sarah, I know this decision may seem unfair. The house has meaning for you too. But Thomas is the one who left completely. He's the one who needs to come home, even if just for a while. If he chooses not to, you'll all benefit equally from the sale. Eleanor, my love, I'm sorry for not discussing this with you. I feared you would talk me out of it. Insist I not burden Thomas with your care. But you've spent 12 years caring for me and my memories of Evelyn. It's time someone looked after you. This is my final attempt to heal our family. Perhaps it's misguided. Perhaps it will backfire entirely. But as a doctor, I know sometimes the treatment is uncomfortable before healing begins. I love you all. I hope someday you'll understand. Richard Mitchell. When Jenkins finished reading, he carefully refolded the letter and placed it on the desk. No one spoke. Thomas stood by the window, staring unseeing at the backyard where he'd once played catch with his father, where his mother had tended her roses, where family cookouts had filled summer evenings with laughter and conversation. This is manipulation from beyond the grave, Michael finally said, his voice tight with anger. He can't do this. Legally, he can, Jenkins replied calmly. And did. It's outrageous, Michael continued. Tom has a life in Boston. I live 10 minutes away. I should be Eleanor's trustee, not him. Your father was adamant about the arrangements, Jenkins said. I advised him of potential complications, but he was insistent. Eleanor, who had been silent throughout the reading, finally spoke. I had no idea, she said softly. Richard never mentioned any of this. Thomas turned from the window to face her. Did you know he was sick? Before the diagnosis. She shook her head. He'd been tired, had some stomach pain. I thought it was just age. By the time he saw a doctor, it was already stage 4. Her eyes filled with tears. I don't need a trustee, Thomas. I have my own money. Richard was being overprotective. The trust isn't insubstantial, Jenkins clarified. Richard converted most of his personal assets into it. The distributions are quite generous, but control of the principal lies with the trustee. Sarah had been quiet, absorbing the information. Now she looked directly at Thomas. What are you going to do? It was the question hammering in Thomas's own mind. A year in Oak Ridge, managing his stepmother's finances, living in his childhood home filled with ghosts and memories and unresolved grief. Impossible. Yet the alternative meant selling the house where his mother had lived and died, where generations of Mitchells had gathered for holidays and celebrations, where his own childhood was preserved in every corner. I need time to think, Thomas said finally. I can't make this decision right now. Jenkins nodded understanding. The will specifies you have 30 days to decide whether to accept the conditions. In the meantime, everything remains as is. Eleanor can continue living in the main house or move to the guest house at her discretion. And if Thomas refuses? Michael asked. Then the house goes on the market, and proceeds are divided equally among the 3 of you after Eleanor receives her widow's share. Michael stood and paced the small confines of the study. This is exactly like Dad, making decisions for everyone without consultation, convinced he knows best. Michael, Sarah cautioned, glancing at Eleanor. No, it's fine, Eleanor said. Richard was stubborn. It's what made him a good doctor and sometimes a difficult husband. She turned to Thomas. Whatever you decide, I don't expect anything from you. I can manage my own affairs. Thomas couldn't muster a response. His mind was racing, calculating what a year away from his job would mean, how he could possibly manage it, whether he even wanted to try. Jenkins closed his briefcase. I'll leave you all to discuss. Thomas, when you've made your decision, call my office. I've left copies of all relevant documents on the desk. The original will and trust documents remain in my office safe. After the lawyer left, the siblings and Eleanor sat in Richard's study, the weight of his final wishes hanging over them like a storm cloud. Thomas felt trapped between impossible choices, caught in his father's posthumous manipulation. Yet beneath his anger was a whisper of understanding. Richard Mitchell had never been good at asking for what he wanted directly. This was his way of asking Thomas to come home one last time. After Jenkins left, the Mitchell siblings dispersed, Michael to call his office and reschedule patients, Sarah to pick up her children from school early. Thomas found himself alone in the kitchen with Eleanor, an awkward silence stretching between them as she washed the coffee cups they'd used during the meeting. You don't have to stay, Eleanor said without turning around. I know this is the last place you want to be right now. Thomas leaned against the counter, watching her methodical movements. Did you really not know what he was planning? No. She placed a cup on the drying rack. Richard kept many things to himself, especially at the end. I thought he was just trying to spare me worry. Thomas studied her. This woman who had been part of his family for 12 years, but remained a stranger to him. She looked tired, he realized. Beneath her composed exterior was the unmistakable pallor of grief. I need to see the guest house, he found himself saying. If I'm going to consider this at all, I should know what I'm getting into. Eleanor looked surprised but nodded. Of course. Let me get the key. The guest house sat at the back of the property, separated from the main house by a small garden. Originally built as a carriage house in the 1920s, it had been converted into a one-bedroom cottage years ago. Thomas's grandmother had lived there for a time after his grandfather died, but it had mostly served as a space for visitors or occasional tenant rentals over the years. Richard renovated it last summer. Eleanor explained as she unlocked the door. I thought he was just keeping busy after retirement, but maybe he was planning this even then. Thomas stepped inside and was immediately struck by how different it felt from the main house. Where the Mitchell home was steeped in history and tradition, the guest house was surprisingly modern. The walls were a soft gray rather than the dated wallpaper of the main house. The kitchen was small but updated with new appliances. A comfortable-looking couch faced a modest television, and a small dining table sat beneath a window overlooking the garden. It's nice, Thomas admitted, genuinely surprised. I was expecting mothballs and dated furniture. Eleanor smiled slightly. Richard may have been old-fashioned in some ways, but he knew I preferred a more contemporary style. This would have been my space eventually anyway, once he was gone. The implication hung in the air. Richard had anticipated Eleanor moving to the guest house, while one of his children took over the main house. He'd been planning for his death long before his diagnosis. Thomas moved to the bedroom, where a queen-sized bed with a simple navy comforter took up most of the space. On the dresser stood several framed photographs. He picked one up, his mother and Eleanor, much younger, arms around each other's shoulders, laughing at some forgotten joke. That was from college, Eleanor said from the doorway. We were roommates freshman year at UConn. Thomas stared at her. You and Mom were roommates? I never knew that. There's a lot you don't know about your mother and me. Eleanor took the photo from him gently. We were best friends for 30 years before I married your father. But Thomas struggled to reconcile this information with his understanding of events. You started dating Dad so soon after she died. Eleanor placed the photo back on the dresser. It wasn't like that, Thomas. Richard and I spent time together because we were both grieving her. We'd both lost the person we loved most in the world. She met his gaze steadily. I never intended to fall in love with him. It just happened. And yes, it happened sooner than either of us expected. Thomas felt disoriented, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. Did Sarah and Michael know? About you and Mom being friends? Of course. They grew up with me as Aunt Eleanor. You did too, though you were younger. After you left for college and then moved away, well, there was less opportunity to maintain that connection. Thomas tried to recall Eleanor's presence in his childhood and realized there were indeed memories. A woman with lighter hair bringing Christmas presents, attending his Little League games, sitting at their dinner table on occasion. But these recollections had been overshadowed by his later image of her as the woman who had replaced his mother. I have something you should see, Eleanor said. Come with me. Back in the main house, she led him to what had been his parents' bedroom. Thomas hesitated at the doorway, not having entered the room since his mother's death. It's all right, Eleanor encouraged. This wasn't how Richard left it. I redecorated years ago. Indeed, the room bore little resemblance to his memories. The floral wallpaper was gone, replaced by pale blue paint. The heavy oak furniture of his childhood had been switched for lighter, more contemporary pieces. Only the bay window with its window seat remained recognizable. His mother had loved to sit there with her morning coffee, watching birds in the garden. Eleanor opened the closet and pulled out a plastic storage container from the upper shelf. She placed it on the bed and removed the lid. Inside were dozens of envelopes, cards, and what appeared to be journals. Evelyn kept everything, Eleanor explained, selecting an envelope and handing it to Thomas. Birthday cards, letters, notes. She was sentimental that way. Thomas opened the envelope. Inside was a card with a childish drawing of what might have been a doctor. Stethoscope around the neck was the only identifiable feature. Inside, in his own unsteady childhood handwriting, Happy birthday, Mom. Love, Tommy. There's more, Eleanor said, pulling out a leather-bound journal. Your mother kept diaries. Richard could never bring himself to read them, but he couldn't bear to get rid of them either. I found them when we were packing up some of her things last year. Thomas took the journal hesitantly. I shouldn't. She was your mother. I think she'd want you to know her thoughts. Eleanor selected a specific volume. This one is from the year you decided to study journalism instead of medicine. Richard was so angry, but Evelyn. She handed him the book. Just read it. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed and opened to where a bookmark had been placed. April 15th, 1998. Thomas called today to tell us he's switching his major to journalism. Richard is beside himself, convinced it's a mistake that will ruin Tom's future. But I heard the excitement in my son's voice for the first time in years. He's found his passion, and isn't that what we always wanted for our children? To find their own paths? Richard can't see past his disappointment yet, but he'll come around. Thomas has his father's determination and my curiosity, a powerful combination. I told Eleanor about it over lunch, and she agrees with me. Tommy will make a wonderful journalist. He's always been observant, always asking the questions others miss. Richard will see it eventually. Thomas stared at his mother's elegant handwriting, her words reaching across time and death to touch him. He flipped forward a few pages. May 30th, 1998. Richard and Thomas argued again on the phone today. I wish they could see how alike they are, both so passionate, so certain they're right. Richard stormed out afterward, probably to Eleanor's to vent. She's always been good at talking him down when he gets like this. I worry about what will happen to this family when I'm gone. Who will be the bridge between my husband and my son? They love each other so deeply but speak such different languages. Thomas closed the journal, his throat tight. She knew she was sick then? In 1998. Eleanor shook her head. No, not yet. Evelyn, she always worried about holding the family together. She knew how similar you and Richard were, how that created friction. Thomas continued flipping through the journal, stopping occasionally to read entries. They chronicled his college years from his mother's perspective, her pride in his achievements, her concerns about his relationship with his father, her hopes for his future. In her private thoughts, she had supported him unconditionally, even when she had seemed to take his father's side in their arguments. Near the end of the journal, Thomas found an entry that made his heart stop. February 12, 2001. Had my annual checkup today. Dr. Stevens found something concerning in my left breast. Getting a mammogram next week. Haven't told Richard yet. No point worrying him until we know more. Called Eleanor instead. She's coming with me to the appointment since Richard is at that conference in Chicago. Strange how calm I feel. Perhaps it's nothing. But if it is something, I need to think about the future. About Richard and the children. About how to prepare them. Thomas looked up at Eleanor, who was watching him with sad eyes. She knew she was sick. 3 years before she died. She knew. Eleanor nodded slowly. The cancer went into remission after the first round of treatment. Richard didn't even know about it until later, when it came back more aggressively. She sat beside him on the bed. Evelyn made me promise to look after all of you if anything happened to her. Especially Richard. She knew he wouldn't handle her loss well. So you married him because Mom asked you to? No, Thomas. I married him because after spending months helping him through his grief, I realized I loved him. Differently than I'd loved your mother as my friend, but deeply all the same. Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. I never tried to replace Evelyn. I couldn't if I wanted to, but I did try to keep my promise to her, to look after the people she loved. Thomas felt as if the ground beneath him had disappeared. Everything he had believed about his mother's death, about Eleanor's relationship with his father, about the fracturing of his family. It was all shifting, revealing a different picture than the one he'd clung to for 15 years. Why didn't anyone tell me? About Mom's illness, about you and her being friends, about any of this? You were already pulling away by then, Thomas. Establishing your independence, building your own life. Your mother didn't want to burden you with her illness when you were just starting your career. Eleanor sighed. And after she died, you were so angry at your father, at the whole world really. You barely came home for the funeral, and then you were gone. When would we have told you? She was right, Thomas realized. He had kept his visits brief, his conversations superficial. He had never given anyone the chance to share these truths with him. There's one more thing you should see, Eleanor said, reaching deeper into the box. She pulled out a manila envelope with Thomas's name written on it in his mother's handwriting. Richard found this last year when we were finally clearing out some of Evelyn's things from the attic. He couldn't bring himself to send it to you directly. He was afraid you'd throw it away unopened if it came from him. Thomas took the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a letter dated just weeks before his mother's death, along with several newspaper clippings of his earliest published articles from his college newspaper and an internship at a small New England daily. "My dearest Thomas," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've hopefully had some time to adjust to a world without your mother in it. I'm writing this on the chance that things between you and your father haven't improved. You're so alike, you know, both stubborn, both convinced you're right. It used to make me laugh, but now it worries me. I need you to know that your father is proud of you, even when he can't say it. He keeps every article you write. He tells his colleagues at the hospital about his son, the journalist. His anger comes from fear. Fear that you've chosen a path that might bring you disappointment or hardship. Fear that you'll be far from home, where he can't protect you. If I'm gone when you read this, please don't use your grief as another reason to stay away. Your father will need you, though he'll never admit it. Sarah and Michael will need you too. Our family has always been 5 puzzle pieces, fitting perfectly together. Without me, you'll need to find a new way to connect. And if Richard has found companionship after I'm gone, please try to be happy for him. I've asked Eleanor to look after him. She's promised me she will. She loves you too, Thomas. She's been part of our family since before you were born. My greatest regret is that I won't see where your talent and passion take you. But I leave this world knowing you've found your calling. That gives me peace. All my love always, Mom." Thomas stared at the letter long after he'd finished reading, tears streaming down his face. His mother's voice was so clear, so present in her words. He could almost hear her reading them aloud. Eleanor had quietly left the room while he was reading, giving him privacy with his mother's final message. Thomas sat alone, surrounded by the physical evidence of a family history far more complex than he had allowed himself to believe. His narrative of abandonment and betrayal was crumbling, replaced by something messier, but also more true, a story of flawed people doing their best in the face of loss and change. Outside the window, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the backyard. The maple tree his father had planted when Thomas was born now stood tall and strong, its leaves beginning to turn with the season. 15 years away, and he'd missed so much. His niece and nephew growing up, his siblings building their lives, his father aging, getting sick, trying in his own stubborn way to rebuild bridges before it was too late. And now Richard Mitchell had left Thomas with an impossible choice: stay in Oak Ridge for a year or sell the family home. Return to a past he'd run from or lose it forever. Thomas carefully replaced his mother's letter in its envelope and the journal in the storage box. Whatever decision he made about his father's will, he could no longer hide behind the comfortable fiction he'd constructed about his family. The truth was here in this house, waiting for him to face it at last. The Oak Ridge Inn's cramped bathroom wasn't ideal for a crisis of identity, but Thomas found himself there anyway, splashing cold water on his face as if it might wash away the revelations of the past 24 hours. After finding his mother's letters and journals, he'd mumbled something to Eleanor about needing air and had walked aimlessly through town for hours before returning to his hotel room. His phone had buzzed repeatedly with texts from Sarah and Michael, but he'd ignored them. What could he possibly say? That everything he'd believed about their family for 15 years had been wrong? That he'd constructed a narrative that allowed him to stay away, to nurse his grievances from a safe distance? Thomas dried his face with a scratchy hotel towel and stared at his reflection. At 38, he looked more like his father than he cared to admit. The same strong jaw, the same crease between his eyebrows when he frowned. His mother's eyes looked back at him, though soft and observant. His laptop sat open on the bed, displaying his inbox. His editor at the Globe had emailed twice about his next assignment, a series on climate refugees in Bangladesh. He was supposed to fly out next week. It was an important story, one he'd been researching for months. Pulitzer material, his editor had said. Yet for the first time in his career, Thomas felt no excitement about the assignment. Instead, he kept thinking about his mother's journals hidden away for years, about Eleanor and his mother as college roommates, about his father collecting his articles in secret pride while denouncing his career choice in public. A knock at his door startled him. Thomas checked his watch, Nearly midnight. He approached cautiously and looked through the peephole to see Sarah standing in the hallway, hugging herself against the cool night air. "I know you're in there, Tom," she called through the door. "Your car's in the parking lot." Thomas sighed and opened the door. Sarah didn't wait for an invitation, brushing past him into the room. "You can't just disappear like that," she said, turning to face him. "Not after everything that happened today. Eleanor told us about Mom's journals, the letters. We've been worried sick." "I needed to think," Thomas replied, closing the door. "And you couldn't answer a text?" "I'm alive, talk tomorrow." Was that too much to ask? Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "I've already lost one family member this week, Tom." The guilt hit him like a physical force. "I'm sorry, Sarah. You're right." She seemed surprised by his easy capitulation, the fight leaving her as quickly as it had come. "Are you okay?" Thomas laughed humorlessly. "I have no idea. Everything I thought I knew about our family seems to be wrong. Dad wasn't who I thought. Neither was Mom. Or Eleanor. I'm not sure who I am in all of this anymore." Sarah sat on the edge of the bed. "Join the club. I've spent all day wondering if I ever really knew Dad at all. The man who made these arrangements isn't the straightforward, practical father I thought I knew." She patted the space beside her. "Sit. Talk to me." Thomas joined her, and for a moment, they sat in silence like they used to as children, shoulders touching, finding comfort in proximity. "Did you know?" Thomas finally asked. "About Mom and Eleanor being friends before?" Sarah nodded. "I have vague memories of them together when we were kids. After Mom died and Eleanor started spending time with Dad, Michael reminded me. It didn't seem strange to us. She'd always been around." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Honestly," Sarah looked at him directly. "Because you never asked. You decided what the story was. Dad betraying Mom's memory, Eleanor as the interloper, and you never questioned it. It was easier to let you believe what you wanted than to fight about it every holiday." The truth of her words stung. "I've been an ass, haven't I?" "Sometimes," Sarah agreed, but her tone was gentle. "But grief makes people do strange things. You dealt with Mom's death by running away. I dealt with it by clinging tighter to what was left of our family. Michael buried himself in medical school. We all did what we had to do to survive." Thomas leaned back against the headboard. "What am I supposed to do now, Sarah? Live in Oak Ridge for a year? Be Eleanor's trustee? I have a job, a life in Boston." "You have an apartment and a job that sends you away more often than not," Sarah corrected. "When was the last time you were actually in Boston for more than a few weeks straight?" She had a point. Thomas's career kept him constantly moving, foreign assignments, research trips, following stories wherever they led. Home was more of a concept than a physical place for him. "The globe would never give me a year off," he argued, though with less certainty than before. "Have you asked? You've given them 15 years, Tom. You've been shot at in Syria, caught malaria in Ghana, nearly died in that earthquake in Nepal. Maybe it's time to call in some favors." Thomas hadn't considered this possibility. He'd built his identity around being the journalist always ready to go where the story was, no matter the personal cost. The idea of staying put for a year seemed impossible, not because it couldn't be arranged, but because it would force him to be still with himself and his thoughts. "Dad's house is big," Sarah continued. "You could convert part of it into an office, right from here. There are stories in small towns too, you know." "Like what?" "The annual Oak Ridge Apple Festival? The high school football team's losing streak." Sarah smiled. "You're such a snob sometimes." "Yes, there's the Apple Festival, which is actually pretty great. But there's also the opioid crisis hitting rural communities, the economic struggles of small businesses against big box stores, the environmental impact of the new development on the north side of town. Human stories, Tom. Just different humans than you're used to writing about." Thomas found himself considering it seriously for the first time. A year in Oak Ridge. A chance to reconnect with his siblings, to get to know his niece and nephew. To understand the father he'd never really known through the house he'd lived in his whole life. To make peace with Eleanor. "What about Michael?" he asked. "He seems pretty angry about all this." Sarah sighed. "Michael's complicated. He stayed close to Dad all these years, took care of things when Dad got sick. I think he feels overlooked somehow. Like Dad trusted you more in the end, even though you were the one who left." "That's ridiculous. Dad and Michael were always closer." "Were they?" "They worked together, sure. But they argued constantly about patient care, hospital politics, all of it. Michael thinks Dad never really respected him as a doctor." Sarah shrugged. Families are messy, Tom. None of us had the relationships with each other that we thought we did. Thomas mulled this over. His image of Michael as the favored son, the one who followed in their father's footsteps, was apparently as flawed as his other assumptions about their family. And Eleanor? How am I supposed to be her trustee when we've barely spoken in 15 years? Maybe that's exactly why Dad arranged it this way. To force you two to talk, to understand each other. Sarah reached for his hand. Eleanor's not the villain you've made her out to be, Tom. She loved Mom. She loves Dad. She's never tried to take Mom's place with any of us. Thomas knew she was right. The evidence was all there in his mother's own words, in the photographs he'd seen, in the renovated guest house prepared with care. I don't know if I can do it, he admitted. Stay here, I mean. I've spent so long running. I'm not sure I remember how to stand still. Sarah squeezed his hand. Maybe that's exactly why you need to. They talked for another hour, about their parents, about the will, about the family dynamics that had shaped them all. When Sarah finally left with a promise to meet for breakfast the next morning, Thomas felt lighter somehow, as if sharing the burden of his confusion had made it more manageable. He opened his laptop again and began typing an email to his editor, requesting a meeting to discuss a potential change in his work arrangements. Then he started a list of what he would need to bring from Boston if he decided to stay. The practical tasks helped ground him, gave shape to a possibility that had seemed unthinkable just days ago. Around 2 in the morning, Thomas found himself driving back to the Mitchell house. The streets of Oak Ridge were empty, the town asleep under a canopy of stars visible in a way they never were in Boston. He parked in the driveway but didn't go inside, instead walking around to the backyard where he and Michael had built a tree house in the maple when they were boys. The tree house was gone now, removed years ago when the tree had been damaged in a storm, according to Sarah, but the maple still stood, solid and enduring. Thomas sat on an old stone bench beneath its branches, the same bench where his mother used to sit while reading on summer afternoons. The back porch light came on, startling him. A moment later, Eleanor appeared in a robe and slippers. Thomas, she called softly. Is that you? Sorry, he replied. I didn't mean to wake anyone. She approached, wrapping her robe tighter against the night chill. I wasn't asleep. Too much on my mind. She gestured to the spot beside him. May I? Thomas nodded, and she sat, leaving space between them. For a while, they simply sat in silence, looking up at the stars through the branches of the maple. I used to find Evelyn out here at all hours, Eleanor finally said, especially after her diagnosis. She said the night made her thoughts clearer. Thomas glanced at her. You really were close, weren't you? You and Mom. She was my best friend for most of my life. Eleanor's voice held a wistfulness that surprised him. We were supposed to grow old together, 2 little old ladies causing trouble in the nursing home. That was the plan since college. The image made Thomas smile despite himself. I wish I'd known. About your friendship, about her illness, about a lot of things. She wanted to protect you. We all did, in our own ways. Eleanor turned to face him. Even Richard, with his gruff criticism and high expectations. He was trying to prepare you for a world he found harsh and unforgiving. Thomas considered this. Did he tell you why? Why he left the house to me this way? Not specifically, but he talked often about regrets in his final weeks. About wishing he'd found a way to bring you home, to mend things before it was too late. She sighed. I think this is his last attempt to fix what he couldn't in life. By manipulating me from beyond the grave. By giving you a reason to stay long enough to see Oak Ridge as home again. To see your family as your family again. Eleanor's gaze was direct. You don't have to do it, Thomas. No one would blame you for walking away. But Thomas realized, sitting there under his mother's favorite tree, that he didn't want to walk away. Not this time. The anger that had fueled his distance for so many years had dissipated, replaced by a curiosity about the family he'd never truly known and the home he'd too easily abandoned. I think I'm going to stay, he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. For the year, at least. See what Dad was trying to show me. Eleanor's smile was gentle. He would be pleased, though he'd probably hide it behind some gruff comment about your career. Thomas laughed, the sound strange and welcome in the quiet night. You knew him well. I did. Not as long as Evelyn did, but well enough. Eleanor stood, adjusting her robe. The guest house is yours whenever you're ready. I'll need a few days to move my things. No rush, Thomas said. I have to go back to Boston anyway, sort things out with work, Pack up my apartment. It'll be at least a week. As Eleanor turned to go, Thomas called after her. I'm sorry for how I've treated you all these years, for the assumptions I made. She paused, her silhouette outlined by the porch light. We all did the best we could with an impossible situation, Thomas. You, me, Richard. None of us got it exactly right. She smiled softly. But maybe we have a chance to do better now. Thomas remained on the bench long after Eleanor had gone back inside, watching the stars and feeling, for the first time in years, that he might be exactly where he was supposed to be. Boston in October felt different somehow, colder, more impersonal than Thomas remembered. He moved through his apartment with a strange detachment, sorting belongings into boxes labeled Oak Ridge, Storage, or Donate. After 15 years in the same one-bedroom overlooking the Charles River, he'd accumulated less than he expected. His life had been designed for mobility, for quick departures to distant datelines. His editor at the Globe, Marianne Shun, had taken the news of his sabbatical with surprising equanimity. Honestly, Thomas, I've been expecting something like this, she'd said during their meeting. You've been running nonstop since you joined us. Everyone reaches a point where they need to stand still for a while. They'd worked out an arrangement, a year of remote work, with Thomas contributing feature pieces and special projects rather than breaking news coverage. He'd keep his health insurance and a reduced salary, with the option to return to his current position when the year was up. Don't look so shocked. Marianne had laughed at his expression. Good journalists are hard to find, and great ones like you are irreplaceable. Take your year. Deal with your family situation. Right when you can. The world's problems will still be here when you get back. Now, a week after his father's funeral, Thomas found himself preparing to return to Oak Ridge not as a visitor, but as a resident. The thought still gave him vertigo, a sense of stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. He'd made a career of parachuting into unfamiliar situations, but none had felt as disorienting as returning to the place he'd once called home. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Guest house is ready whenever you are. He moved her things out yesterday. Michael's still processing, but coming around. Kids excited to have Uncle Tom nearby. Thomas smiled at the last part. During his brief return to Oak Ridge for the funeral, he'd connected with Emma and Jack in a way that surprised him. They were smart, curious kids who treated their globe-trotting uncle with a mixture of awe and comfortable familiarity, as if his absence had been weeks rather than years. Emma had already extracted a promise that he would help with her school newspaper. Jack wanted stories about the dangerous places Thomas had visited. As he sealed the last box of books, a knock came at his door. It was Lena Diaz, his downstairs neighbor and occasional dinner companion when they found themselves home at the same time, which wasn't often given their busy schedules. So the rumors are true, she said, leaning against his doorframe. You're actually leaving. Thomas gestured at the boxes. Just for a year. Family situation. The mysterious family you never talk about, Lena said with a knowing smile. Must be serious to pull you away from the action. My father died, Thomas found himself saying. Left me the family house with some conditions attached. It's complicated. Lena's teasing expression softened. I'm sorry about your dad, Tom. That's rough. Thanks. It's been enlightening, I guess. Turns out families are more complicated than war zones sometimes. Lena,